Okay, so lesson 1 continues with the second video, which focuses on planning out your tables. So by the end of this video, you should be able to plan, design, and code a web page table. You should also be able to create a web page table that displays text and/or images. So just on a basic level, be able to code it out and plan it out. And then towards the end of this lesson, you should start thinking about also how we might use a web page table to create a menu bar. So maybe you won't have a clear picture of that, but note that's where we'll be heading in the next videos, is we'll be looking at how to create that menu bar. So start brainstorming ideas of how we will actually code that menu bar. So again, here we're focusing on the planning, designing, and then finally the coding phases of a table. So there are 3 main steps that we go through every time we create a table. First, we need to determine if this table is really necessary. Do we actually need this table? What's its purpose? Is it actually making information more readable on our web page? Then the second step is we actually plan out that table and we think through all of the formatting that we might want, all of the spanning that we might want, those types of things. So be thinking and planning through what that table is going to look like. Maybe you'll actually draw it out, put some fake text in there, start thinking through what it might look like, things like that. Then the third step is once we have that planning all done, then we'll finally jump in and we'll begin coding our table. So it's not until after we've planned it out and really visualized that table that we'll actually code it into an HTML document. Before adding a table into your website, you always want to decide if that table is actually necessary. So a general rule of thumb is if a table will actually help you to organize information on a page. So maybe some text and images need to be formatted together, whatever it might be, and if that information being organized makes the page easier to read, then it's a good idea to use a table. If that table is just cluttering things up, or if it doesn't actually enhance the page, there's not really a purpose behind it. So make sure that it's actually helping to make your web page better. And then just keeping in mind that tables are useful for displaying structured and organized lists of information. So we can all see a math table that organizes information and data. That'd be a good time to use a table. Another time to use a table would be to display text and images that must be positioned in a specific manner. So again, that table really helps with the organizational piece, but always making sure that that table has a purpose before you start planning. So on the screen, you'll see that we have 2 different web pages. They both display the same information, but one uses a table and one does not. Now, the table does make it a little bit more organized and I think a little bit easier to read, but is the table 100% necessary? Maybe, maybe not, depending on who you are and what you believe that table's purpose is. So just making sure that your information can actually be organized well into a table and that it's helpful. Not just making a table for fun to make a table. So really thinking it through and seeing, does it have a purpose? Now, once we've decided that a table is in fact necessary, we start out the process of planning that table. And the first step in this process is always to sketch that table out on paper before coding. You should never just start coding a table without a visual image of where it should be headed. So you always need to sketch out that table. The second step is you're going to determine the number of rows and the number of columns that that table will need. And then you'll determine if there are to be any headings and if there's to be any spanning within your table. So you're really going to think through those details and make sure you have a clear picture of where your table is headed. And you'll notice on here I put a side note. It says conceptualizing the table on paper saves time when trying to determine which HTML tags are needed in coding. So making this picture now and really making it visual and seeing what tags will be needed makes your coding process much more efficient and effective. So again, you can see here why making a table visual can be helpful before you code, because you'll notice here I have 3 different tables that seemingly display almost the same pieces of information. They just get more complex as we go through. So this first one displays names and times. Nothing wrong with that, but coding for that names and times table would be different than the names and times table including also a distance, and that would be even different then recording multiple times for a person on the dates that they ran and the distances that they ran. So you can see how even though these display the same types of information, the planning for these tables and the coding for these tables will be different. So having a clear picture of where we're headed is the first step in table planning. So on the screen in front of you, you see a complex table that relates to those tables on the previous slide. You can see we chose the more complex table, and you'll see that we have header cells for the meet dates, the 5K, the 10K, and the cross-country team. You'll also see that we chose to include spanning for cross-country, as well as 5K, 10K, and the meet dates areas. And then you'll see that all the rest of the cells are data cells, except for here we have some cells that are in fact centered. So you'll notice that this took quite a bit of planning before they even started to code it. Now before we jump in and actually code tables, we probably should talk about the tags and attributes that go along with tables. And I think that these are pretty simple. First, you'll notice that the table tag is how we open and close the start and end of a table. So you put the table tag at the start of the table and you put the closing table tag at the end of the table. And this encompasses your entire table. Then you start and end each row with a TR tag, which should make sense and tie together with table because that's simply saying table row. And we're going to always plan out our number of rows and plan a table row by row as we go through. So you'll use the TR tags to code each row. Then you have two choices for your data cells. You can use a heading cell or just the plain data cell. These heading cells will make things centered and bolded. So this is the TH, so you can see it stands for table heading. And then you can see you have a TD tag, which you could use if you just had normal table data cells that need to be left aligned with normal font. So we'll code our tables by starting with simply our table tags. Then we'll have a set of TR tags for every row. And then within each TR tag, we'll use either a TH or a TD tag, depending on the purpose of that cell, to code what goes into each cell. So we're actually going to walk through and we're going to write the code for the table that's in front of us here. So the first thing that we need to think through, that first question we need to ask ourselves, are how many rows will be contained in my table? And if I look here, I have 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows, 4 rows. So my first question, how many rows will I need? I will need 4 rows for my table. Now what you'll notice here is I took this information and I applied it into my code. Now we are just writing these by hand at the moment, but what you'll notice here is we have an opening and closing table tag, and then indented in are all of my rows. So here is row 1. Here is the beginning and end of row 2. Here is the beginning and end of row 3. And here is the beginning and end of row 4. So you'll notice that my first question was how many rows do I have? And then I immediately created my table and created the number of rows in my table that I would in fact need. Now that we've identified the number of rows that our table is going to have, we need to decide which type of cells, if we want header cells or data cells, will we need in each row. And if you look here carefully, this first row contains table header cells because they are centered and they are bolded. So we know those are going to use the TH cells, whereas these 6 cells down below in these 3 rows are normal data cells that will use the TD tag. So after we've decided how many rows, we look at the types of data cells, if they're header cells or data cells, that we'll need in order to code those cells appropriately. Now what you're seeing on the screen in front of you is actually the code for that entire table. So if you look very, very closely, here we have row number 1. And inside of row number 1, we have cell number 1 and cell number 2. And cell number 1 has the words first heading, followed by a break, followed by the words row 1, followed by a break, followed by table heading. And so this should say header, not heading. So what you'll notice here is that we have our first cell. So this is row 1, cell 1, and that corresponds to here. Now if we look down at the next chunk, you'll see that we have row 1, cell 2, right after that. And you'll see again, it's a table header tag, and it corresponds right with this second cell here. Now, if you look down below as we go to each new row, here we have row 2, cell 1, cell 2 within that row. Row 3, cell 1, cell 2 within that row. Row 4, cell 1, cell 2 within that row. So it's a pretty simple process. You start with the table, you get your number of rows, and you program all of the rows, and then you really code this row by row. So you start with the first row and you program its columns one at a time. Then move to the second row and program its columns one at a time. You go to row 3 and you program its cells one at a time, and row 4 cells one at a time. Now, once you've got that table coded on a basic level, you then start to think about your formatting. And things you have to think about are, 1, are there items that need to be programmed and formatted within the entire table? Are there specific rows that have specific types of formatting? And then are there any specific cells in your row that need specific formatting? So we start thinking through and brainstorming what needs to have a specific font type, or what needs to be bolded or emphasized, what color does the text need to be, what should the background color be, etc., etc. On the next few slides, you're going to see the different attributes for the table tag, for the TR tag, and then for the TH and TD tags together. And what you're going to notice is that while some of these overlap, the ways in which they apply to different tags are kind of like the image and the paragraph alignments being different, where they have kind of a similar purpose but slightly different. So really pay close attention to these different attributes. So within the table, the alignment tag controls the table's alignment within the web page. So it can be left, right, or center. So this is within the page. It has nothing to do with the text that's contained in the table. It just centers the table within the browser window, or to the left or to the right, whatever alignment you choose. Then background color, if you use the BG attribute, it will set the background color for the entire table. So that will give it all of the cells a specific hue. Now from there you can choose your border, and that will define the width of the table border in pixels. So remember, that's that outline of your table. Then from here we have cell spacing and cell padding, which we'll spend more time discussing in a later lesson. But cell spacing defines the space between cells in pixels, while cell padding defines the space within a cell in pixels. And again, I'll show you visual examples of these so you can really distinguish between cell spacing and cell padding later on. Then you have the columns attribute, which defines the number of columns, and this is something you should always have in your table so that you know ahead of time and can tell the browser how many columns to plan for. And then from here, the width sets the table relative to the window width, so you'll want something like 90% of the window. This always comes as a percent and takes up a specific amount of space percentage-wise within the window. Now the TR tag only has 3 different attributes. The first is the alignment tag, and this one is different than the table alignment tag. So the table alignment tag aligns it within the page, whereas the TR, the table row alignment tag, controls the alignment in the cells in a row. So that can be right, centered, or justified. You control the alignment of the text within the cell. Then you have the BG color, which will set the background color for that row. Something to note is that if the table has a background color of green, and then you set the table row to have a background color of yellow, what happens is because this row is more specific, it will actually have that yellow color. So note that you can have BG color in multiples, and it will just take the most specific tags attribute. But BG color will set that background color for the entire row. And then vertical alignment controls the alignment of the content vertically within the cell. So for example, you have a cell here. If you have middle alignment vertically, your text will go in the middle of the cell. If you have a top alignment, that text will go in the top of the cell vertically. And if you have bottom alignment, it will go in the bottom of the cell vertically. So noting that the TR tag has align, BG color, and V align. And then finally, the TH and the TD tags actually have the same attributes and they apply in exactly the same way, simply because both of these tags deal with cells specifically. So note that they have an alignment tag just like the TR and the table tags did, but this one works like the table row tag where it is talking about the alignment of the content within the cell. Then we have a background color which sets the background color for that particular cell. And then we have two new ones called column span and row span. And what column span and row span do is they actually set the number of columns or rows that that cell spans. So for example, if we had our table up here and I had something like the following, what you'll notice here is that this particular cell spans 2 rows. If we had another cell up above, this particular cell spans 2 columns. So when we're talking about column span and row span, we're talking about the spanning there, and we will spend an entire lesson talking through how we actually plan for those tables that contain cells that have that spanning. And then finally, the last attribute, similar to the TR tag, is we have that vertical alignment again, which is talking about the content in the cells, and it can be top, middle, or bottom for vertical alignment. So the last thing we're going to do here is we're actually going to write out the code for the following table. So to start, we always start with our table tags. So I'm going to have an opening table tag here, and then I'm going to have a closing table tag down here at the bottom. Then from here I notice I have 1, 2, 3, 4 rows, and I know that I always code tables based on their number of rows. So I'm going to do, okay, there's row 1, there's row 2, there's row 3, and there is row 4. Then from here, I know that I need to know the number of columns in my table. So if I look here, I have 1, 2, 3 columns. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add that into my table tag here. And I'm going to use the attribute for columns, and I'm going to say, okay, the columns are equal to 3 columns. And then from here, I'm going to start thinking about the different cell types that I have within my table. So I'm going to do this, and notice here that I have a heading cell for these first 3 in this first row. Since all 3 of these are table headers, I'm going to use the TH tag. And then if I look, the first cell in that first row right here has the word name. So I'm going to write name and then close off that cell. The next cell has the word strand and then close off that cell. And then the next row has courses taken. So again, a header cell, and it says courses taken. And then I can close off that cell as well. So I have now coded the first row in full. And so I've coded this first row, and then I move on to the second row, which I notice has just data cells. So I'm going to start here with the John Smith row, and now this is just using a data cell. So I have John Smith. Then the next one, so here I have to close off this cell here. And then I have the next row says hardware and networking. And then I close off that data cell. And then that third cell has the courses that John Smith took, which appear to be operating systems and HTML. And then I close off that data tag as well. So we're going to repeat this process for the next 2. So I'd like you to try and complete this table within your notes. So you're going to want to create the row for Laura Miller and then create the row for Jackson Park as well. So see if you can use that same strategy to finish out those two rows within the table. Once you think you've got it, you can get it checked off by me if need be, and then you can move on to the assignments for this particular lesson.